This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio. Today we're going to flash back to a great show we did with newly inducted IAQA Hall of Famer Jeff May. We first aired this show back in early 2016, and it was episode 400. We had Jeff May on to talk about common and under-recognized sources of indoor bioaerosols. It was a great show, so sit back, relax, and enjoy it. Please visit our YouTube page and subscribe. Leave a comment. It's IAQ Radio. You go to YouTube and check out last week's show, our first combination audio and video show. We did a review of the IAQA conference and the Sloan Microbiology of the Built Environment Research to Practice workshop. Microbiome of the indoor environment, research to practice. We'll be following up on that quite a bit. Also, if you could check us out on Facebook and like our Facebook page, we'd also appreciate that. We'll be back live next Friday at noon with the next episode of what we're now calling IAQ Radio Plus. So let's get started by thanking our marquee sponsors.
IAQ Radio marquee sponsors are John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Healthy Indoor Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Particles Plus, engineers and manufacturers, feature rich particle counters, air quality monitoring, instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. ParticlesPlus.com. Count on us.
Good day, Jeff. Do we have you on the line?
You do. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes.
Great to have you.
Good morning. Oops, just hit noon. Okay.
Just barely. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. It's been a while. John was looking. I think it's been like 5 years, John, if you recall correctly, that last time you joined us. But we're really happy to have you back. We got a chance to connect down at the IAQA conference. You did a great, couple great presentations down there. And we're going to start with a question that Cliff actually got to attend both of your presentations. One of the questions he had was, what type of mold is used for allergy testing, and what's wrong with that concept?
Well, as you know, there's there are millions of different molds. I suppose there's, a lot fewer molds that are present indoors, but typically, what they've tested for is Alternaria alternata, and that's primarily, at least in the Northeast anyway, that's an outdoor mold. And because each mold has many, many different allergens, I mean, there could be 10 or 20 different allergens, proteins in a particular mold spore. You can't test for all of them. They used to test with extracts, but they don't really, so they use these monoclonal antibodies. They test. It's called Alt-1, and they just test you for one antigen. And so they can't test you for enough different things. And it would take too long. It'd be like a pincushion. So they just test you for this one thing. And if you're not allergic to Alt-1, then they consider you not being allergic to mold.
And that would have serious implications when people think they're not allergic, and maybe they are to a different type of mold.
Oh yeah, I actually had a client with hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and they did the standard panel. Now that's not really allergy, but it's the same idea. They tested her against asked for some particular species of Aspergillus, her blood serum anyway, and she was mildly positive. And then I sent samples of the Aspergillus that was growing in her furnace. Her furnace had been underwater, and nobody thought to clean it out. And she was highly reactive to that, to the mold that was growing in the system. So it made a huge difference when they cleaned it up. So it can be that specific. It can be, one particular species of mold that someone's reacting to, and they can never really test you for that.
One of the presentations you did was on mechanical systems and the types of sick building problems that can be associated with mechanical systems. It was called Mold in Mechanical Systems, Leading Cause of Sick Building Symptoms. I'm curious on that particular case, since you brought it up. Was cleaning enough with this sensitive person to get them to the point where they could then go back into the home?
Yes. I don't know. I wasn't involved in the actual cleaning, but I don't think it was that, complicated a system. But what I often see, there'd be fibrous lining material inside of what's happened in a rooftop unit, let's say, and you can see from looking at the fibrous material around the air conditioning coil that it's been vacuumed and it looks perfectly clean. And if you take a sample from that lining material, it can be full of spores and hyphae. So, it's not necessarily a visible problem. And in those situations, the lining material really has to be removed and replaced. And obviously not with fibrous lining material, but something with a solid surface, either, aluminum coated fiberglass or something like, Armorflex closed-celled foam.
Cliff, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. What's the difference between macro and micro fungi and their effect on wood and framing lumber?
Yeah, that's a really big one. I mean, you see people getting completely hysterical about mold and comments about how mold's going to destroy the building and destroy structural components, and it's simply not true. There's two large groups of fungi. I mean, there are lots of them, but you can separate them into at least two categories. One is microfungi, and the other one's macrofungi. So the macro means big, and those are the kind of fungi that you can see in the woods, with the mushrooms, and the spore-forming structure is big. It's the mushroom cap. And then you have the microfungi, and those are really the molds. So when you look at a patch of mold, you see maybe some black or brown, some colored surface. But when you look under a microscope, you can see that the spores are all organized in a particular way. And the spore-forming structure is called a conidiophore, and that's comparable to a mushroom cap, except that it's a microscopic thing. And the big difference between the wood decay fungi and the microfungi is the fact that really very few of the microfungi are wood decay organisms. So, you could have the whole interior of a space covered with mold. It doesn't mean that there's going to be any kind of a structural issue whatsoever. The microfungi don't have the enzyme systems required to break down the cellulose that's in wood, and they also cannot break down the lignin, which is the other major structural component in the wood. So all mold is just growing on the surface.
And Jeff, what are these actinomyces that we hear about in indoor environmental quality investigations or indoor environmental quality issues, and why are they important to indoor environmental quality?
Well, I guess the actinomyces can cause hypersensitivity, pneumonitis. They require, very wet conditions. So, for example, when they were having a lot of HP in the automotive industry, they traced it to worker exposure to aerosols, bio-aerosols from the cutting fluids, because the cutting fluids have water in them. So that's the environment that these organisms can grow in, and they're kind of strange. I'm not that sure about the sort of biological sort of classification, but when the spores that actinomyces produce are the size of bacteria, but they look and they grow like mold, so they actually have hyphae, and they require very, very high moisture content. So typically you'll find them on foundation walls growing on dust, or you can find them in humidifiers, so they'd be floating like a little white floating colony on the surface. And as I said, they're very, very small spores, so they can get into the alveoli, and that's why they cause the hypersensitivity pneumonitis. And because they're so small, none of the labs that do the analysis can actually see them. And so, you have to use oil immersion, high-power microscopy to even see them. So, like I stain my samples pink with acid fuchs, and sometimes I'll see these little pink blotches. They don't have any size or shape, and so then I'll go to, from 400 to 1,000 power, and suddenly I can see all of the, the spores and hyphae. So they're definitely present, and, people can be getting sick from them, and it's not something that the lab would pick up at all.
I'm just curious, you use a microscope quite a bit in your investigations, and I do as well. One of my guys that helps me out is pretty good with microscopy. How easy would it be to teach, a typical indoor environmental quality investigator out there to be able to do some microscopy in the field to help them with screening samples? They can always send a few to the lab to verify, but how difficult would it be? How long would it take to teach someone to do what you do in the field with microscopy?
Well, it doesn't take that long, actually. I've given classes where, I rented microscopes and had, 10, 15 people in a class. Everybody has their own microscope, and just go at it for a couple of days. And a few of those people, that's all they really do now is air quality. So they do send their samples out. Some people do their own samples, but it takes a lot, it takes a lot longer to get into the sort of subtleties. But for the more obvious things, you could. I think some of the labs train pigeons to identify Stachybotrys under the microscope. They just drop a peanut, and every time they identify a stachyspore. But it is. It's not that difficult. See, I guess the difficulty would come in really distinguishing all the different, the different types and then sort of counting things. But to determine, let's say, if something is just mold on a wall. Or let's say I often see fiberglass that's black, and you have no way of knowing whether that's soot or mold growth. So you can take a sample, you can know in 2 seconds whether or not it's mold or not. But I've done that a couple of times where I took a microscope to a job where it was some emergency situation. I'd be there at midnight, but typically it takes too long to do a lot of microscopy on site. But there is one small microscope that Terry Brennan uses. I can't think of the name right now, but that it's a small thing. You can just stick it on a surface and do some identification. So the answer to your question is it's not that difficult for the sort of simple stuff.
Okay, and I'll ask Terry about that. That's an interesting point. Cliff?
Yeah, it's called PEEK. It's a PEEK microscope.
PEEK. Okay.
I think it's PEAK. Yeah. And it can go up to the best one is 400. That's what 200 might help a little bit, but 400 would be that would be better.
That's about the lowest you can go, I think, to see things. Aspen are pretty small, about 2 micrometer. Is that about the lowest you can start to evaluate that?
Well, I'd say 200. You don't see a whole lot at 200, but I for example, when I look at a sample, I'll start, sometimes at 200 just to get a general picture of what's going on. But to really see things clearly, you got to go at least 400. And some of the labs do it at 600. The problem is the higher the magnification you use, the longer it takes to to look at the sample. So it's it's a toss up between how long you can spend versus how much you see.
Cliff?
Yeah, Jeff, could you opine on the leading cause of sick buildings?
Well, yeah. I guess I'm somewhat prejudiced. I have, I've got a lot of allergy problems myself, so, I'll go into buildings and, everybody's running around, they're working, and so, I can tell I have a problem. So, I would say that it's the mechanical system. The air conditioning is really it. I Googled one time air conditioning and sick buildings, something like that, and there wasn't a city or a country in the world that didn't have a case of sick building due to air conditioning. And the reason is very simple. First of all the air in the building goes through the mechanical system, and if you're in a part of the country where or any country where you cool the air to the dew point, you get water, you now have a wet coil. And, if there's any dust at all on the coil, there's going to be microbial growth. And then the air coming off the coil is at 100% relative humidity, so mold can start to grow at, let's say 80+% relative humidity. So you get all that mold growing on surfaces, and then you have the condensate pans that get full of, all kinds of microorganisms. So, and then in the wintertime, then those pans dry out, and then you're just blowing all this sort of dust around.
What type of filter do you recommend for your clients on a forced air mechanical system?
Well, since the real problem with all of these mechanical systems is the dust and the high humidity or the water. So if you keep the dust out, then you're not going to have all of these problems. So the most of the biodegradable dust particles are bigger, so maybe bigger than 10 microns, say. So you have cornstarch granules, pollen grains, skin scales, pet dander, cellulose fibers. I mean, they're all 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 microns in size. So if you don't filter out the soot and the soil particles, which can be less than a micron in size, it's not really that relevant. So ASHRAE says MERV 8, minimum efficiency reporting value filter for air conditioning, and MERV 8 is probably adequate. I recommend the deeper 4-inch filters, the pleated media filters that have a MERV 11 value, rating, and that's really more than adequate. And the only problem that you get into with any of these filters really is the fact that there's any kind of bypass. So you'll often find somebody's got a decent filter, but air is getting around the filter. So good filtration with no air bypass, and you'll have a clean system, and it'll be healthy.
Cliff, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Joe. Jeff, what percentage of air duct cleaners clean AC coils, and where did you get this statistic?
Yeah, not enough. Actually, I got it from. It's interesting. It was a NATCA, National Association of Duct Cleaners. They surveyed their members to see how many of the members cleaned the air conditioning coil, and only 40% did. And I always thought it was just strictly a question of of profit. Like if you're a blow and go duct cleaner, you come and you go, you just hook something up to the duct system and you suck it or whatever, and you're out of there. If you're going to clean a coil, that's a very, very labor intensive thing, and you cannot possibly make the same kind of money for the time. But I also found out something very interesting. I talked to one of the duct cleaners this year, and he said that he didn't do. They get a lot of referrals from heating HVAC companies for jobs to clean ducts, but the HVAC technicians do the duct cleaning, so they didn't want to compete with the HVAC people, so they don't do the coil cleaning. So that was a new sort of wrinkle in the whole situation.
And Jeff, with respect to UVC lights, they're known to be antimicrobial. What other effects, lesser known, may UVC lights have on HVAC components?
Well, the UVC light is very, very energetic, and so it'll destroy most organic compounds, and that includes glue. So there's been some situations where the ultraviolet light was irradiating the filter, and it destroyed the glue, and it allowed the fibers to get into the air and basically defeated the purpose of the filter. But it's actually it's a lot worse than that. I mean, these ultraviolet technology has been around for I don't know, probably almost 100 years, and it's used to kill viruses and bacteria in the air. And the reason it's effective, the way they've used it is with, let's say, lights at the ceiling in schools or hospitals, and you have no airflow, basically. There's just a little bit of convection, so the residence time is long. I mean, it's going to take a few seconds to many seconds to really to kill anything. So they use that ultraviolet principle, though, when they put in these UV lamps into heating and air conditioning systems. And, I just sort of reviewed this thing. Let's say that the air is going through a duct at a few feet per second, so there's not enough residence time. So if you Carrier on their website has a calculation, and in order to irradiate air and successfully to kill microorganisms, you need a UV tube that's about 150 feet long. So most of these tubes they put into systems are only 4 to 6 inches. So they tell you it's going to clean the air, or disinfect the air, but it can't. So it's completely useless, and people throw $800, $1,000 away on these things. The other concept that they use is that you can irradiate the coil and the pan to kill microorganisms there. And commercially, that works beautifully. They have, let's say you have a flat panel coil, and you have 4 or 6, lamps the length of a coil. Everything gets irradiated. It works beautifully. You can irradiate the pan, but the commercial, the homeowner units are a couple of inches. They don't irradiate anything.
Cliff?
Jeff, what parts of the HVAC system are most difficult to remediate from fungal contamination, and why?
Well, I suppose wherever you have fibrous lining material, it becomes impossible. I guess the worst situation is contaminated ductboard, because that really has to be replaced. Commercially, there are some systems that Fiberlock has some coatings for fibrous lining material that can encapsulate it, but I would guess that's one big problem. The other one is if you have mold growth in a flexible duct. One particular situation that I see that's problematic, at least in my area in New England, some homes have hot water heat, baseboard or whatever, and then they have air conditioning with the air conditioning unit in the attic. So all of the duct work is in the attic. Now, in the wintertime, you've got condensing conditions in the attic. It's very, very cold. And if all of the supplies and the returns are open, you get convection flow, and warm air goes up into the some of the ducts. Cold air comes down elsewhere, and if it's cold enough or damp enough in the house, you get condensation. And I actually looked at one home where the guy was running a humidifier in his bedroom, and the trunk lines had water dripping down all of the supply lines that had mold growing on the surface of this flexible ductwork. Everything had to be replaced. So flexible ductwork, if it's really dirty, has to be replaced. So that's the other difficulty in terms of duct cleaning. It's getting the material all out of that type of duct. I don't think you can meet the NATCA standard because of it's so fragile.
Jeff, I'm curious with respect to, again, going back to identifying different types of contaminants, what are some of the common indoor contaminants that are regularly misidentified as microbial contamination by inexperienced inspectors or microscopists?
Well, I would guess that the most common one is spray paint spheres. So whenever you spray paint anything, you get a lot of sort of aerosol mist, and these are very, very small particles, like maybe 3 to 10 microns, and they're typically they'll be full of titanium dioxide particles, which are submicron particles. But if you don't look carefully at one of these particles, it looks like a black spore because the titanium dioxide is opaque. So whenever I have a question about one of those particles, I will turn the the stage microscope light off, and then I use a flashlight, a very bright light from the top, and look at the particle. And if it reflects white light, it's not a spore, it's a paint sphere. So that is certainly, one big one. And I think another mistake that a lot of counters make is that they misidentify basidiospores as penasp spores. So the penicillium and aspergillus spores are just small and round, and a lot of the basidiospores are the same. They are different if you look carefully, but if you don't look carefully, it's easy to misidentify. So I hardly ever see penicillium aspergillus spores outdoors. There are other parts of the country where they're plentiful, but it's easy to misidentify that, and it's very important because the largest source of indoor air quality issues with respect to bio-aerosol anyway, it's exposure to aspergillus or penicillium indoors. So if you misidentify some basidiospores outdoors, you can come up with an outrageous number. I mean, there could be tens of thousands of basidiospores in the outdoor air, and indoors you won't find that many. But if you call them penasp outdoors and you see a few penasp indoors, you'll say there is no problem.
Jeff, we're almost to halftime, and I've got two more quick questions on mechanical systems. One is the connection between heat recovery ventilators and mold problems. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one of my sort of favorite gripes, because buildings, they keep making buildings tighter, and I can see a day when they're going to be requiring heat recovery ventilation, and the heat exchange core in an HRV is pretty small. I mean, it's less than a foot square, and so that's where the filter is, and the filter is typically not very efficient, and often they're not attached properly, and so with minimal filtration and lots of dust. Remember that what you're doing is you're sucking in outdoor air 24/7, and you're sucking in house air 24/7. So you have a lot of biodegradable dust particles, and you need very, very good filtration. And most homeowners never read the directions. They never change the filters or clean them, and so you end up with mold problems, because in the summertime you're drawing in very humid air, and then in the wintertime you're taking maybe moist air from the shower, from the bathroom, and passing it over this freezing cold air, so you get condensation. And unless you can accommodate that that moisture, then you may get some wet dust and mold problems. So in the end, I would say most of the heat recovery units that I've looked at had mold in them. Not a lot, but mold. And in one case, actually it's happened in two cases, I think, where we turned it off and people, all their allergy symptoms disappeared.
One more quick one before we go to halftime. What type of label should be affixed to mechanical systems, air handlers?
Well, no, I guess nobody does. But one of the things that I had recommended, actually, I don't know if I put that in the talk or not. I think I did, but
you did.
Really, I did that. They have warning labels on ladders. They have warning labels on cups. If it's got hot coffee, you could burn yourself. And yet here we have all of this air conditioning equipment, and there's a lot of people out there getting sick from the mold that's being aerosolized. So I think it's up to the industry to tell people that that they have to maintain the mechanical equipment, and if they don't, that they could be consequences. Like if you plug something in and you're holding on to the live prongs, you're going to get a shock. You think of things today that have all these warnings, but air conditioning and heating system does not come with any warnings. And I think, and the same thing actually with heat recovery or energy recovery ventilation. It has to be made clear to people that there are consequences for neglect.
So you could put something like annual maintenance required in big red letters or something like that, or semi-annual, whatever.
Yeah, but I would be more, more serious. You see, look at all of these warnings and show you people falling off of ladders. It needs to state really, in words that you can, this can somehow, it doesn't have to be, some paraphrase of this can make you sick. if you do not maintain it.
Great point. We will be back with the second half of our show with Jeff May after we thank our sponsors, and we've also got a brief segment with Lou Harriman at halftime.
IAQ Radio would like to thank our association sponsors. The Indoor Air Quality Association, a nonprofit multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Visit them at IAQA.org. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them, wolfsense.com. IAQ marquee sponsors are John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at johndon.com. That's JONDON.com. Healthy Indoor Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Particles Plus, engineers and manufacturers feature rich particle counters, air quality monitoring, instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. ParticlesPlus.com. Count on us.
Okay, we're back with the second half. Before we get back to Jeff May and talk a little bit about unusual indoor bioaerosols, we've got Lou Harriman on. Lou, we want to talk to you a little bit.
Well, yes, I imagine many of the listeners will remember the National Academies study that helped us out with the issue of damp buildings in human health now more than 12 years ago. And this is a recognition of the fact that we know that fine particles are a problem indoors, perhaps in some cases even more of a problem than they are outdoors. But it's not a problem that's been well recognized. It's not a regulated problem by any means. So this is an effort, I think, to understand the nature and the extent of the problem, and then begin figuring out what to do about it. What sort of things can be done in a low-cost way, and what sort of things are appropriate to do to mitigate the health difficulties that come from high concentrations of fine particles indoors. So it's moving on towards better understanding of all the health issues that we have indoors. We've got things in some ways much more under control outdoors than we do with the problems indoors. So this is an effort, a non-regulatory effort, to begin understanding what we ought to be doing about these issues.
And then maybe raise some awareness on top of that.
Very much so. And again, where there are no laws associated with this, it's important that the public understand what the risks are and what they can do about it. And so that's I think what this effort is about.
All right. Well, let's get back to our interview. Again, thank you very much, Lou, as always, for joining us. Let's get back to Jeff May. Jeff, we had a second paper you presented at the IAQA conference, and it was, let's see if I got the title right here, The Common and Under-Recognized Sources of Indo Bioaerosols. Now, the first half of the show, we talked a good bit about a common one, I assume, which is mold. Let's talk a little bit more about, first, the idea of what are some of the under-recognized sources of indoor bioaerosols?
Well, I guess let me just sort of comment also, about as in just not necessarily a bioaerosol specifically, but just on the that particulate matter program that's coming up. I mean, I would find that probably one of the really common indoor particulate, submicron particles that are in homes come from burning candles, jar candles. So, and you can also get that from combustion oil combustion equipment if it's not vented properly. And those particles are small enough to get into the alveoli and actually pass directly into the bloodstream. So a lot of the really small particles, they come in and then they're suspended in the air and then they go out again. But there are definitely health effects from the exposure. And just to sort of widen that, there's a researcher in Norway who's looked at soot particles to see if there are any allergens on them, and they've actually found that soot particles in homes with cats actually have cat allergen on them. and they found also pollen allergens on soot particles. So they may not be large. Obviously, a soot particle is very small. There's not a large quantity of allergen. On the other hand, if you're breathing in a lot of the soot that was on the cat, I suppose you might get enough of that allergen. So I call these, surrogate allergens, and our surrogate allergen can be just about anything. I mean, I always, I say just to, picture a like an air conditioning condensate pan with all the dust in there. There's going to be rust particles and drywall particles and maybe some lint fibers and skin scales, and it's all sitting in this sort of microbial muck. And then in the heating season, all of that muck dries out, and some of those particles get aerosolized. So they become, I think they become, and I mean nobody's really looked at this or proven this, but I mean they become surrogate allergens. So you could see, and I have seen this actually. I was in a computer server room that had a humidifier on it because they humidified the air to 50% to keep prevent sparks from occurring. So there was nothing in the air except for the rust particles that were coming from the pan in the humidifier that was corroding, and people were having air quality issues there. These particles are, some of them are less than a micron. So there's microbial growth in a water reservoir, and then there are particles that get wet, and then the allergens dry out on the surface. Another way, and this is only recently, I was talking to Eva King about this when it first sort of hit me that, people talk about dog dander and cat dander and exposure to allergens. Well, dander, skin scales, dog skin, cat skin, it's a protein called keratin, and it's a very, it's a structural protein, and it's not allergenic at all. So it's actually the secretions of the sebaceous glands that secrete the allergens that are then covered or coated on these dander particles. So that actually pet dander particles are these, surrogate allergens. They're big, they're 25 microns, but they really don't. The actual skin itself is not the allergen. It's the water soluble allergen on the surface that causes the the allergy response. So just about anything can be allergenic, bioaerosol, or even inorganic, drywall dust. So, let's say you've got mold growing on drywall. The mold is secreting enzymes, and the drywall, the gypsum particles, they're very small. They may have some enzyme on them, and you may be allergic to that particular enzyme, and so have health symptoms as a result of that exposure. But there's no way to measure that. We have absolutely no way to figure any of this out.
I want to go back for a moment because I got an interesting email that I think is something we should mention. We were talking about misidentified, contaminants under a microscope, and Tony Havoc actually sent an email saying that starch grains, including from gloves, can also look like mold spores, as can fern spores and pollen and oil, etc. So it seems like there's a lot of different things that can be misidentified.
I would say if you're really inexperienced, you could call a starch granule a mold spore, but the mold spores really the sizes they're all pretty similar, size and shape. Starch granules can vary in size quite a bit, and I have polarizers. If you use two polarizers and you put one at the light under the stage and another one at the eyepiece, and you rotate that, there's it's called optical dichroism, I think. You get color changes, so you can tell starch granules. Plus, if you use iodine, you can just add a little bit of iodine to a slide, and all the starch granules turn black.
Yeah, if people know to do that, I guess. I got another question here, Jeff. What is a common problem among fans, blowers, and other air movement type devices?
Well, I guess anything, anything that moves air is going to collect dust particles by impactation. If you look at a fan that's been running for a while, the blades are all, covered with dust. You look at any kind of, grills where there's airflow. So wherever you've got airflow, particles accumulate. So you got there's some pretty obscure things. I think my favorite one is the refrigerator. I mean, we've had clients who just cleaned their refrigerator and all their health symptoms went away. So a refrigerator collects an enormous amount of dust on the coils, and also if it's a frost-free refrigerator, in the condensate pan. Now, if you're allergic to cats and somebody had a cat in the apartment before you, you're going to be exposed to that cat dander forever from the refrigerator. If there's mold, or usually there's yeast and bacteria, sometimes mold as well growing in that condensate pan, then that also gets aerosolized, and you can have allergy symptoms from that. I actually, the way I discovered this was that, I have asthma, and I was sitting in my kitchen, and every once in a while I'd start to cough, and I never could figure it out. And one day I associated that every time I had symptoms, I was when the refrigerator turned on, and I took in those days the condensate pan or the drip pan was in the front. You just pull the grill off, and the pan was full of water, and there was a moldy onion sitting in the middle of the water. And I cleaned that, and that was the end of my problem.
Huh. Interesting. Let me, Cliff, let me turn it over to you because we're going to run low on time, and you got quite a few questions. I want you to pick out the best ones.
Okay. Let's see. First of all, what do dust mites do?
What do dust mites do? They do three things. They defecate, they fornicate, and they masticate. That's it.
Okay.
That's it.
Masticate.
What a life.
I've had, Ken Gehring from Thermistore used to have whenever he had a booth at a show, and he would always have dust mites for people to look at, and he was kind enough to give me some colonies, and that's what I used to sit up at night watching dust mites, see what they do.
I think you need to get a life, Jeff.
No, I don't. You're right. People tell me that all the time. I love what I do, and it's there's this hidden world. It's just so, it's so fascinating. I mean, I've been known to watch this one eye on the Super Bowl and one eye on the dust mites.
How many different types of dust? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Cliff.
Speaking of dust mites, what bedding in a home is a really underestimated reservoir for dust mites?
Well, let's see. Mostly, I guess it's somewhat actually the opposite in a sense. I mean, there's all this nonsense on the internet about there's 10 pounds of mites in your mattress. I mean, thank God it's wrong. I mean, I sample when I do an investigation in a home. I always take a dust sample from a mattress, and I would say that probably less than half of the mattresses have, maybe even, significantly less have a really serious mite problem. So it's not, it's certainly one of the biggest causes of asthma, but I find, people sitting in chairs, cushioned chairs for hours at a time, they'll get dust mites in their chairs. I mean, dust mites basically, the dermatophagoides dust mites that cause, most of the asthma. They eat skin scales, so there's a ton of food, and so the only thing they really need is body moisture or moisture from the air. So I've actually, you're going to love this, get a life. I was in bed one time with my wife, and I was under the covers. I wanted to measure the relative humidity, and I was under the covers with a sling cyclometer and a flashlight. Can you imagine? Oh God!
Oh, your poor wife.
There was one reservoir that you mentioned in the class or in your presentation that I never really thought of.
Oh well, I find dust mites in. Well, the thing is, there'll be mites wherever there's moisture. I mean, I had one guy sent me a sample from his dust from around his sink, and they were storage mites, acari, living under the steel rim. There was food and dampness under there. I found mites in a soap dish next to a sink. Even in the fiberglass of the fiberglass insulation around a dishwasher. So wherever you've got dampness, you've got mites. And I think there's a huge problem with mold-eating mites. There are many species. I must find at least a dozen different kinds of mites in homes, and wherever there's mold, there's mites 100% the time.
I think
the one that you mentioned was pet bedding. I never really thought about it, but it's just I came back home. I had my wife wash the
good for you.
bed. Yeah,
sure. I sampled. I take samples from pets. I'm allergic to a lot of them. I have the homeowner pet the animal, and then I'll take a sample. And you'll find dust mite droppings on animals because it's in the bedding. Dogs get asthma. In some dog beds there are so many mites that there's something called Tyrophagus putrescens. It's a big mite, and it actually eats the smaller dust mites. And dogs get allergic to that. It's called T-put. So dogs get asthma. So people don't wash or clean their dog beds for 15 years sometimes. And wherever you've got that moisture from an animal, body moisture, you're going to get mites.
Jeff, are they the same type of mites that you find in a dog's bed as you would find in a human bed, or is it a different species?
I'm not. I would say it could be the same because they're just eating the house dust and skin scales. So the real difference in mites is with the mold, the mold-eating mites. Wherever you've got mold, or you have plants, you'll get all different kinds of mites that are they're not the skin scale eating mites.
Jeff, what
about?
Go ahead, Cliff.
I think there are a couple that we need to touch on that are real important. What are bird bloom particles?
Yeah, that's another good one, right? Well, the birds give off, skin scales the way, other animals do. They're very, very weird looking. Their character, they have very odd shapes, and they have holes in them, very strange. And that's the bird dander particles. But then birds also give off bloom particles, and those are very, very small particles. They're the size of mold spores, 1 to 3 microns in size. And it's a white powder, basically. When a bird flaps its wings, you can sometimes see that. And in homes, like I was in one place, they had, a lot of parrots, and everything had white dust on it, and it's all bird bloom. The purpose of the bloom is to repel water. It's sort of hydrophobic, and it keeps the wings dry. So, but because they're 1 to 3 microns, they actually can get into the alveoli, and they serve as surrogate allergen. In other words, the bird dander or bird bloom particles are keratin, but they have the bird antigen on them, and that gets into the lung. And hypersensitivity pneumonitis is called allergic alveolitis in England. There are a lot of bird keepers, I forget the percentage, but it's pretty high, that actually get very, very sensitized to birds. Now, where this becomes important for your average person is because people love feather pillows, and I would say that, and quilts. I would say that I take a pat sample, I call it. I just tap a pillow or tap a quilt, and I collect the aerosol with my Burkhardt sampler. I look at that with a microscope, and I would say that about half of the feather-filled items that I test are the feathers have never been cleaned, and so all that bird bloom comes out. And I actually had just a correspondent, really, a fellow who became deathly ill with hypersensitivity pneumonitis. I call it, or people call it duvet lung. His daughter gave him a very expensive quilt for Christmas, and by February he couldn't breathe anymore.
Interesting. Cliff, keep going. You're picking out the ones I'm interested in.
Okay. Let's see. What causes wet wool carpet to smell like a wet dog?
a wet sheep.
A wet sheep, wet dog,
sheep,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've wondered about that for years, and I think from doing all this microscopy, I finally figured it out that the the hair, wool is hair. It's got a structure like a hair, so there's a cortex fibers in the middle. They're sort of rope-like fibers, and then on the outside of the hair, there's cuticle particles, and they're flat sheets, and it's kind of like an armadillo or something. They're all
It looks like scales.
Yeah, scales on a fish, exactly. They're all lined up, and so when you stain a sample, the first thing you see if there's a hair is that the stain goes underneath the cuticle, and so when I saw that, I realized that that's, if you happen to be a sheep, you're sweating and, you're going through your everyday life, whatever you do. And so all this sweat and body odor is in the fluid on the surface of the hair. It gets underneath the cuticle. Maybe it even goes into the cortex. I don't know. There's still spaces in there. And so now you process that into a sweater or something, and, you've still got all of that, the sheep that is stuck in between these little plates. So now when these things get wet, the water goes in, and then when it dries, it comes out again, and it brings some of those chemicals out, and that's what you smell.
Jeff, I'm curious, what is the connection between what connection may a thunderstorm have on pollen?
Oh, yeah, another interesting connection that, rain, and this was one of the talks at the IAQA meeting showed this, you'll get rain, I think it was David Gallup maybe, you'll get rain cleans the air out, but then there are some organisms that release their spores in the rain, so other times you'll see a lot of spores. You never know for sure, but a lot of pollen grains are big. They're maybe, they're 50 microns bigger, and they contain many, many starch granules, and the starch granules are maybe 5 microns in size. And I've seen this in the lab, when you put stain on an outdoor sample, some of the starch granules explode when the stain hits them, and all of the little starch granules leak out. I have some really nice pictures of that. And so the theory was, and it was noticed in Australia, that after heavy rains during certain seasons, they would have tremendous uptick in the asthma admissions in the hospitals, in the emergency rooms. And they theorized that it was due to the fact that the water was causing these pollen granules to explode, and then they're releasing the allergen on very, very small starch particles rather than on the much, much larger pollen particle.
Where in the bathroom may growing actinomycetes be found?
Yeah, well, I did show that one. I showed that one slide. It was in a toilet on the 3rd floor, and I guess that the toilet hadn't been flushed in a long time. So there were actinomycetes, but they're, as I said, they really need very, very wet conditions. So it might be there. It might be in a humidifier or on a foundation wall. I don't know. Let's see. I don't. Surprisingly, I haven't seen them in air conditioning pans and that sort of thing. And it may be that there's too much competition. I have seen actually mold with actinomycetes growing around it, so they're probably living off of digesting the mold spores.
What about in like a shower head? Have you tested shower heads often or checked them?
That's a good one. Yeah, no, actually, I was just we got our water from the Merrimack River, and I think there's a horrible amount of stuff. I just spent a lot of money putting all this filtration in, but I'd sometimes look up at the shower and there would be black tendrils hanging out of the holes, and it's it's Oreobasidium mold and bacteria. It wasn't actinomycetes. And unfortunately, we have a coffee maker, and I can't leave anything with water here because stuff grows in it. So it's one of those, what do you call it? Those
Keurig.
Yeah, Keurig. So I turn it upside down to drain all the water out. So this morning I turned the thing upside down and all this black crud came out. I couldn't believe it. I just, I can't help it. It grows around this, the faucets. I took the aerators out of my faucets and it was just all full of black. Just gross stuff. Gross.
And
so,
Jeff,
we're exposed to it all the time, and I guess it happens to be one of the things that doesn't bother me.
I've got one more. What micron-sized particles are attracted by magnetism?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you came up with that. I'm not sure.
No. I think that you've already mentioned it, and it seems to me that you mentioned small metal particles, rust particles, and it would just seem to me.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, that
would be the one.
That's it. Yeah, okay. That the rust particles carrying behaving as surrogate allergens. So I know there are people actually that sell some kind of purification equipment with magnets around water supplies, but I don't think there's too much of an association there as far as the bio-aerosol goes.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. It's been fascinating as always. It's been too long. We'll have to get you back again. And I talked to you about joining us for our event here in October. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. October 10 through 12. We hope to have you join us for the Healthy Building Summit.
Okay. Well, it's always fun. I love listening to you guys, and again, I congratulate you on your awards.
Well, thank you.
Well deserved, boy.
Well, thank you very much. I've been very happy to hear the feedback on that. Is there anything before we go that we missed that you'd like to add?
No, I just, I guess what I just wanted to say that, having, written all these books and everything from, years and years and seeing what's out there, and I just, to this day, I'm amazed at really how little progress has been made. That's all. They're just, in big buildings, people are still getting sick. They are still, blowing bio-slime out of, drain lines and shoveling sluck out of pans. And, I just can't understand it. That's all.
Well, I share your, your concern there. I mean, it's just, I can't figure it out either why buildings aren't better maintained, although I guess there are some. It's getting a little better in some areas, but we also have to keep in mind we always get caught into the bad ones, I guess.
Yeah, that's true, but it's just there's not enough awareness, and I think one of the problems, I did some work in a hospital. They didn't want to they confiscated all my testing equipment. They didn't let me test anything. They don't want to know. Like, if you can figure out what the problem is in a building and people are having health symptoms, then you've got, legally you have, liability there. So nobody wants to test. They don't really want to understand things. But in some cases, they're happy to clean everything up and, just sweep it under the carpet, so to speak.
Yeah, just don't let them know what it was, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Clean it up and put it away. Well, Jeff, thanks again for joining us. I look forward to talking to you and hopefully getting together in October.
All right, thank you.
All right.
All right. Take care.
This is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks to this week's guest, Jeff May. As always, a lot of fun, very fascinating information with Jeff. Also, thanks to Lou Harriman for joining us at halftime, and Cliff, of course, thanks to you, and great thanks for the assist on putting a bunch of questions together after watching Jeff.
No problem.
And, of course, to John, you got to have faith at the controls. We were a little nervous starting out, folks. The talk show was giving us a hard time, but we're in. We're done. We had another great week. Thanks to our growing group of loyal listeners out there. Nice live audience today. Please come back and join us next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.